Hello, everybody. Professor Mendoza here. This week's lecturing is on the topic of surrealism as a way into the work of Chicano artist and writer Harry Gamboa Jr. So you'll be reading some of his work, and you'll be looking at some of his video work and film work as well. If you have read his work or are somewhat familiar with it, you probably already have a sense of how strange and often absurd almost a lot of his work can seem. And so it may be a little bit difficult in first approaching his writing and his film work, especially if there is not a context of the historical art and political movement of surrealism and the avant-garde tradition that Gamboa's work reflects and comes from. So that's what I'm going to be doing here with this lecture, is providing a context for Harry Gamboa's avant-garde Chicano work, and that context involves the tradition of surrealism. So I'll talk about that first before I get into looking specifically at Gamboa's writing and film and other work. So as we move through this lecture, a few guiding questions to have in mind here. You want to be thinking about and thinking towards, if you haven't looked at his work yet, then, as you begin to read it, you want to be thinking towards this question of how and where we see the concepts of surrealism reflected in Harry Gamboa Jr.'s Chicano work. The second guiding question to have in mind here is what is the value of this kind of artistic approach in the specific socio-historical context of the contemporary United States? So I'm going to jump around history a little bit. We're actually going to start looking at the 1930s and 40s, when the surrealist movement really developed first, and then actually we'll move back a little further in history than that, and then we're going to look at specifically the avant-garde Chicana artwork of the famous collective group called ASCO that Gamboa was a founder of. So this will all provide a lot of historical background over about the last 100 years or so. But what I want you to think about here is what the value might be of this kind of artistic and political approach in the specific context of today, of the contemporary situation and issues of current United States life. And then the last question I want you to have in mind here is what is the relationship between fascism and fun? And this is a reference to the short video it's a kind of a video interview with Harry Gamboa Jr. that was conducted within the last several years, so it's pretty recent. But there's one point where he talks about the idea of having fun and fun just as a general concept. And but he talks about it in reference specifically to the kind of rising fascism that we see taking hold in the United States and in the world in these right-wing movements. And so I want you to think about it, because I think it's a very important point. In the interview, it passes kind of quickly, and it's almost kind of a flippant remark, which is characteristic of the way Gamboa kind of speaks in general. Kind of, it's always kind of joking a little bit. There's always a little trickster element to what he does. And so it's a kind of comment that it's almost like a throwaway thing, but if you're paying attention, I think it's really important for understanding his work and his approach And I think it's important for understanding how to answer that second guiding question of why these kinds of surrealist techniques and ideas may be really important, maybe even more important than ever at this particular moment in time. So I want to start with some historical context here for the surrealist movement. And this was an international avant-garde, meaning the front guard, the front line, an art movement that developed in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. So for those unfamiliar with the term avant-garde, what that means is, you know, kind of the people at the front edge or the front line of things. So generally, avant-garde is understood to be very experimental, pushing boundaries, very innovative, kind of forward-thinking and forward-looking. People on the avant-garde are usually the ones who kind of shake things up and create new paths forward, right? The opposite of the avant-garde would be the very traditional, very conservative elements. And in whatever, you can apply this in art or in political movements or social movements or culture, et cetera, right? So surrealism was an international avant-garde movement that developed starting around the mid 1920s, and but really took off in the 30s, kind of had its high point in the late 30s and into the early 1940s. Now, if we think about that period, nearly 100 years ago now, an important political context here to consider is what else was going on at this time around the world in the 1920s, and then especially into the 1930s and 40s. If you remember 1929, there was the global stock market crash, and we had the Great Depression all through the 1930s. Well, at this point, I should say the first Great Depression, because unfortunately, we are now very clearly living in the midst of the unfolding of the second Great Depression. And that actually gets at the point I want to make here. Economically, you had this market crash in the late 1920s, and then the 1930s, you have the Great Depression. And parallel to that, intertwined with these economic and political and social conditions, at that same time, of course, you had rising fascism taking hold in Nazi Germany, in fascist Italy with Mussolini. And so what we see here at this period were very, very similar economic and political conditions to what we see today, especially now. With a very large and growing wealth gap and inequality in terms of control of resources. And you also saw a kind of militarization of everyday life, growing surveillance apparatus, and so forth, right? And all of that in specific places unfolded as the rise of fascism. You also see it in some ways in Japan as well, right, with Imperial Japan at this same moment in the 1920s, 30s, and into the start of World War II. So surrealism was a movement by avant-garde artists, at first mostly in Europe, and the epicenter of the surrealist movement was France at first. André Breton is considered kind of the grandfather of surrealism, or one of the founders. And at first, at this time, it was a response to this specific violence of rising right-wing fascist movements in the 1930s, and that kind of militarization of everyday life, and the the kind of inevitable push towards what became World War II, of course, with invasion and conflict and so on. So the surrealists were responding to what they were seeing happen in society around them. And they, at the same time, they were also responding to a more general social and ideological conditioning that was taking place, again, kind of interwoven with these larger shifts that were happening culturally and socially and politically. So even before things started to slide down into fascism, the surrealists were already very concerned with the way that post-industrialist capitalism in the first part of the 20th century was shaping everyday life according to a kind of capitalist way of thinking and being. And you could think of it as a kind, not to simplify it, but or oversimplify it, but it's a kind of conditioning of everybody into being good, compliant workers, right? Kind of like worker ants, factory bees, and very much accepting of capitalist values and principles um, in people's everyday behavior and actions. And the artists at this time were really concerned with what they were seeing in terms of that conditioning that was happening. And in particular, as I'll talk about later, they were concerned with the way that mass urbanization was playing a big role in this kind of conditioning of a new way of being, a new, almost like a new kind of human self, right? As more and more people begin to move to the cities and the cities begin to develop and grow into these mass urban centers. This was a new thing, right? The kind of 20th century city that developed in large part out of the growth of the explosive growth of the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, 18th and 19th century. So these are their kind of general and specific concerns. But in fact, we need to take a step back a little bit further even to understand the historical roots of the surrealists who started formulating their ideas, writing manifestos, and making their art in the 1930s and 40s especially. But we need to step back actually to look at the historical roots of surrealism in another art movement, which was called the Dada movement, or simply Dada. This was the kind of predecessor avant-garde art movement that took shape really in around 1916 and 1920. It was kind of the high point of Dada, although if you can go back a little earlier to beginning around 1910 or so. But it was really around 1916 that we see Dada artists begin to make an impact and gain worldwide attention for what they were doing. And so the Dada can be considered a predecessor to the Surrealist movement that followed. And of course, what was going on at this time around the world, 1916 to 1920, of course, you have World War I. And that's important for understanding what the Dadaists were about, and similar to what the Surrealists were trying to do. With World War I, you had unprecedented violence and mass scale destruction and killing. And this was particularly difficult for people to understand and deal with beyond the scope, the scope of this new kind of warfare, in part because if you look at the second half of the 1800s, right, this was at the height of the Industrial Revolution. And at this point, there was a kind of a very utopian belief in the future of technology and mass society and industrialism and capitalism. In other words, as people entered into the 20th century, there was this great feeling of optimism and hope that all these new technologies, all this rapid development and expansion of capitalism would lead to a utopian future for all of mankind, right? This idea that that there would be no more war and we would solve all of our issues and of hunger and so on, and that everything going into the 20th century was going to be this kind of ideal reality that had never existed in human history, and it was all in thanks to the Industrial Revolution, to capitalism, and to this rapid development of technology. The reality of what happened, of course, as we entered the 20th century was actually that all of that technology and advancement ended up being used in this new kind of warfare uh, that, that involved mass killing and mass death on a scale we had never experienced, right? So that's World War One, right? The idea of even having a world war had not been really possible until the advent of those kinds of technological advances. So you had this late 19th century utopian dream of a mass technological society, and going into the 20th century, all of that was turned into a dystopian nightmare of World War One. And so people were really devastated by this, not just because of the sheer magnitude of the violence, but because it was very sobering, a kind of sobering reality check on this idea that all our problems were going to be solved. Again, drawing parallels, I think it's very similar to this kind of techno-utopian discourse that we have seen, especially over the last 15 to 20 years or so, coming out of that kind of Silicon Valley tech industry types, so people like Elon Musk and Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos at Amazon and so on. There's this idea that this high tech uh, um, world is going to kind of save humanity with all of these tech solutions to our problems. The kind of catchphrase, if you've ever watched the comedy show Silicon Valley on HBO, there's a kind of cliche anytime anyone's giving a pitching an idea or a product, whatever, in Silicon Valley. Um, the underlying ethos or argument is always that whatever they're doing is seeking to make the world a better place, right? And so there's this kind of belief system and ideology that I think so many people have bought into, that the tech industry is opening up these utopian futures for us. But as we see playing out kind of in real time, with as crises hit in the context of the climate catastrophe and context of the epidemic, what ends up happening actually is all of that tech really functions to reshape the world into much more of a kind of nightmare place, right? In terms of the levels of surveillance, in terms of how people are kind of atomized and isolated from each other, and yet tech is there to create this false sense of connection, right? Social media and Zoom and all that kind of thing. Meanwhile, all that tech is being used to uh, gather and amass huge amounts of data, even more than they were already taking from us before the epidemic crisis. And so if you are, kind of paying close attention to how this is all unfolding, in fact, it looks more and more like all of this advancement in the tech industry is really leading us down a kind of nightmare path. There is a show on Netflix, if you have access, that you may want to check out. If you haven't seen it, the show is called Black Mirror, and it's a kind of serial. So each episode is its own kind of separate thing that they don't continue on. But the kind of common theme that connects them all is imagining how our technology today will unfold and play out into various kind of dystopian nightmare scenarios in the future. And the show has got a lot of attention and a lot of recognition, but especially because so much of what makes it really disturbing is that a lot of what it imagines as the quote unquote future, we can actually see unfolding already today. So some parallels there. So that's what's happening with Dada. In 1916 through 1920, you have these artists who were responding to the reality of World War I, who were responding to the reality of this utopian vision being kind of shattered and turned on its head into a dystopian nightmare of violence and death. Dada can be considered an anti-art movement in a way. So it starts, I'll explain what that means, but it starts first in Switzerland in response to World War I. And part of it was, of course, protesting the senseless waste and turbulent disorder caused by World War I. But in doing that, the Dadaists weren't just critiquing or focusing on the military or the government, or the economic system even. They were looking specifically at the role that art and artists played in sort of contributing to these bigger socio-cultural, socio-political problems that gave rise to World War I, especially through the expansion of capitalism and industrialism at the time. So a lot of what the Dadaists were doing can be seen as a kind of rejection of how art was appreciated, defined, and created, how art was understood. And so the Dadaists revolted against traditional art. They poked fun at established art with very deliberately shocking, vulgar, and nonsensical work. So they were trying to not just to shake up society and culture and the political establishment more generally, but very specifically, they were trying to shake up and disrupt and really dismantle the art establishment and people's very ideas of what constitutes quote unquote art in the first place. One of the most famous examples here of Dada was Marcel Duchamp's ready-made urinal, which he called Fountain. And so the story here was that Duchamp, he was one of the famous, probably the most famous Dadaists, and he had an art show opening. And so he went and found an abandoned urinal and signed it Armut, which is just a silly absurdist name, which kind of reflects the absurdism of the Dadaists, right? He signed it Armut and installed it in the gallery as his piece, right? And this was kind of one of the first examples of what's called found art. This was in 1917, this caused tremendous controversy. In fact, people were ready to riot, and art critics and so on, and they were furious and enraged, in part because they actually got what Duchamp was doing, which was to raise questions about what art even is and who gets to decide what is art, who gets to decide quality and value of art. So this piece was a real middle finger to the whole art establishment and all of these ideas about art that were used to, in part, to kind of maintain and hold up these very conservative structures more generally. And so this really pissed people off. They were furious with it, which is always the sign of uh, an effective avant-garde artist, right? If you are angering people because you are, directly questioning and attacking these underlying values that people um, live by and structure society by, and if you're doing it effectively, then usually you're going to anger somebody, right? And so that's what we see here with Duchamp. What the urinal fountain also demonstrates, again, I kind of mentioned this, but is an element of absurdity and absurdism that was always at work with the Dadaists. Their name itself actually reflects this. Dada. It doesn't really mean anything. It's a kind of nonsensical term, almost like babble, right? Like da 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 da. And that's on purpose. Um, Partly what they're doing or saying is they are attacking the absurdity and the absurdism of the violence that they see around them with World War One, and the just the kind of absurdity of the society they were living in. But also along with that, what this reflects is a kind of underlying response of playfulness and ridicule and fun. So in other words, they're deliberately being absurd and silly in response to this very serious absurdity of violence and death, as a way to destabilize the seriousness, as a way to disrupt it, and to challenge people in their seriousness of themselves and their ideas about how the world works. And so that's something very important to keep in mind here all throughout, is this sense of playfulness and silliness and absurdity and absurdism. And this gets to that last guiding question about the idea of fun, and it helps to further to understand where Harry Gamboa Jr. is coming from. And when you read his work or when you see his video work, you will immediately see this kind of wild absurdity in terms of the kind of images he uses and the kinds of the ways he tells stories and stuff. So I want you to keep that very much in mind.